Area 51, what they don't want you to know. If you knew what I know, you wouldn't be here right now. That's what the message said. No name, no context, just those words, followed by a coordinate in the middle of the Nevada desert. I should have ignored it. I should have deleted that message and moved on with my life. But you know how curiosity works, right? That tightness in your chest, that insistent thought of, what if? I'm an investigative journalist, or at least I used to be. My name is Ethan Carter, and I've covered everything. Political scandals, conspiracy theories, even stories about UFOs and alien sightings. I always thought these things were just folklore to sell headlines, until this message arrived. In fact, it was just the beginning. I got in the car and drove for hours through the desert. The road was deserted. The kind of road you only take when you're running from something or chasing something you shouldn't. When the cell phone signal disappeared and the radio started to crackle, I knew I was close. The coordinates led me to a cabin in the middle of nowhere, small, old, and seemingly abandoned. The door was ajar. There were fresh footprints in the sand. My instincts told me to turn around, but I was already too committed to give up. I walked into the cabin, and the smell of mold and dust filled the place. There was a table covered in yellowed papers, black and white photos, and cassette tapes. I pulled one photo closer to the light and my heart skipped a beat. It was a grainy image of a group of people, all with terrified expressions on their faces. On the back of the photo were names written in shaky handwriting, and one of them was mine, Ethan Carter. My hand shook. This didn't make sense. I'd never seen that picture before, but there was my name, written in a familiar, firm script. Before I could react, I heard a noise outside the cabin, footsteps on the sand. I looked through the crack in the window and saw a black car parked. On the road, no license plates. The back door slowly opened, then the phone vibrated in my hand. Unknown number, I answered. The line was filled with static, but I heard a low, distorted voice say, "You've been here before, Ethan. Welcome back." The line went dead, and then the car on the road was gone. Just like that. No engine sound, no dust kicking up, like it had never been there. And that's when I knew I was in trouble. I stood in the cabin for a while, my heart pounding. The photo was still in my hand, the name Ethan Carter engraved on the back, as if someone wanted to make sure I saw it. The black car was gone, literally gone. I tried to rationalize. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was a mirage. But I knew better. I knew something was very wrong. I looked at the papers spread out on the table, diagrams, coordinates, aerial images of a hexagonal installation in the middle of the desert. I recognized the pattern immediately. Area 51. It was like someone was handing me a map to hell. Next to the papers was a tape recorder. I put in one of the tapes, pressed the play button, and the sound of heavy breathing filled the air. "They're watching us," a low, trembling male voice said. "I've seen what they're hiding in there. It's not about aliens. They want you to believe it is. But it's much worse. It's ancient, and it's waking up." A scraping noise in the background interrupted the recording, followed by the sound of a door slamming shut. The voice grew louder, desperate. "If anyone finds this tape, don't go there. Don't make the same mistake I did. They're everywhere. They can see you now. They can hear..." Static. The recording ended abruptly. I felt a chill run down my spine. Ancient? What did that mean? I gathered up the papers and left the cabin, throwing everything into my backpack. I had to get out of here. My car was parked a little ways down the dirt road. I started walking quickly towards him, but the feeling of being watched followed me like a shadow. It was then that I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I turned around slowly. Nothing. I kept walking. More footsteps behind me, this time closer. "Who's there?" I shouted. No answer. I ran to the car, unlocked the doors and got in, locking everything behind me. My fingers trembled as I tried to start the engine. Nothing. I tried again. Nothing. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel and looked up at the rearview mirror. And that's when I saw it. A man was standing behind the car, tall, dressed in a black suit, expressionless on his face. But what made me freeze was the detail of his eyes, completely black. No irises, no pupils, just a dark void that seemed to pull me in. He raised his hand and pointed at me. The car radio crackled, and a familiar voice came from the speakers. "You've been here before, Ethan. You know how this ends." I stepped on the gas, and the engine finally started. I backed up hard, but when I looked in the rearview mirror again, he was gone. I didn't know what was happening, but I was sure of one thing. That thing, the man in black, wasn't human. And he knew exactly who I was. I drove aimlessly for hours, the empty road stretching out before me like an endless tunnel. My eyes kept returning to the rearview mirror, expecting to see that man in black standing there with those dead, empty eyes. But he never appeared. The car radio was off, but I could still hear a low hum, a distorted sound of static that seemed to come from inside my head. Sometimes through the noise, I could swear I heard a voice whispering my name. Ethan. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white. I needed answers. That photo, the papers, the recording, everything pointed to Area 51. But how would I get there? I stopped at a gas station in the middle of the desert to try to compose myself. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting a sickly pale light on the cracked concrete. An old gas station attendant stood behind the counter, fiddling with an ancient cash register. I approached slowly. "Excuse me," I said. "I need some information about Area 51. The old man stopped fiddling with the register. He didn't look at me right away, but I saw his face tighten. "Son, you shouldn't be asking about that. I just need to know how to get there." He looked up. His eyes were gray and dull, like fogged glass. "There's an old, abandoned road a few miles north of here," he said hoarsely. "It'll take you to the outer perimeter, but don't go any further. Don't even think about crossing the boundary." "Why?" I asked. He leaned over the counter. The smell of stale cigarettes and sweat saturated the air between us. "Because what they keep in there is not something you want to see." I pulled away and went to the bathroom to wash my face. The water ran brown for a few seconds before clearing. I stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror. My face was pale, my eyes sunken. That was when the lights flickered. The gas station radio, which wasn't on, began to emit a low static, and through the static I heard, "Ethan." I turned to the door, but it was locked. "You've been here before?" Suddenly the sound of footsteps echoed outside, slow and deliberate. "You know how this ends." The lights flickered again, and the sound of footsteps grew louder. I ran to the door, but it was locked. I knocked on it, hard. Hey, get me out of here!" Then I saw him. The man in black was outside, standing right in front of the glass. Duba. His eyes, that black void, stared at me. He raised his hand, his long thin fingers touching the glass, and then he smiled. The glass in the door began to crack. First a small crack, then a shattering sound. I ran to the back of the bathroom, looking for a way out. I banged on the wall, on the sides, until I found an old ventilation grate in the ceiling. I climbed up on a sink and started pulling on it. With all my strength, the glass in the door shattered with a loud bang. I managed to open the grate and pull myself into the duct. I crawled as fast as I could, the metal cutting into my hands and knees. Behind me I heard the sound of footsteps, echoing in the duct, slow, steady. "You can't escape, Ethan." I finally saw the light outside. I threw myself out of the shaft and landed on the hot desert sand. When I got up, I looked back. The man in black was standing at the shaft entrance, just watching me. I got up, stumbling in the sand, and ran to my car. I started the engine, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I looked in the rearview mirror, he was gone. I knew where I needed to go now. The old abandoned road was waiting for me, and I knew the answers lay beyond the gates of Area 51, even though I didn't like what I would find there. I drove down the abandoned road, my heart pounding in my chest. The moon dimly illuminated the path, casting twisted shadows across the cracked asphalt. The car's headlights were the only real source of light. After about an hour of driving, through the desert, I saw the signs that I was close. Rusty signs warning of government property, cameras mounted on tall poles, and a gate surrounded by barbed wire. I parked the car a ways away and continued on foot. The fine sand bit into my sneakers as I made my way through the darkness, the cold wind biting my face. The fence surrounding the perimeter was tall, but part of it was frayed, with holes in the edges. I took a deep breath and crawled through one of the holes, my heart pounding so loudly it seemed to echo in my ears. I felt like a trespasser, a convict about to be discovered. After crossing the fence, the silence was overwhelming. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just that low humming sound coming from somewhere ahead. And then I saw it. A low metal building, almost hidden under the sand. There were no signs of life, no lights in the windows, but the humming sound was coming from there. I approached it slowly, my hand shaking as I turned the handle of a metal side door. To my surprise, it opened with a sharp click. Inside, the building was plunged into opaque darkness, lit only by a few red emergency lights that blinked intermittently. The walls were made of metal and covered with old wires and monitors. The smell of rust and mold filled my nose. Then I saw something that made my stomach turn. Photos. On one of the walls were hundreds of black and white photos. Some showed distorted figures, humanoid shadows with limbs that were too long. Others showed the faces of people, missing people, I realized. Men, women, children. Some of the photos were stained with something dark. Blood, maybe. In the center of the photos was a blurry image of something that looked human, but its eyes were completely black. The caption below read, "Subject 9, experiment failed." A recording began to play somewhere in the hallway. The voice was distorted, cold. Subject 9 showed signs of consciousness during procedure. Fusion was incomplete. Result is unstable. Immediate containment recommended. My feet began to move on their own, carrying me toward the sound. I passed a row of numbered metal doors. Some were locked, others were ajar, revealing shadows and twisted shapes in the darkness. I came to a door with the number 9 painted on it in faded red. The doorknob was cold beneath my fingers. I turned it slowly. The room was dark, but a figure sat in a chair in the middle of the room. His arms were tied to his sides, his head slumped forward. Suddenly, the figure looked up. I caught my breath. It was the man in black. "I've been waiting for you, Ethan," he said in a low, sharp voice. Tried to take a step back, but my feet were rooted to the spot. What are you?" I whispered. He lifted his head, his empty eyes glowing in the dim light. "I am what they created, and you are the key to finishing the job." The room began to shake. The wires hanging from the walls sparked, and the air grew thick and heavy, as if I were breathing smoke. I tried to run, but the man in black slowly stood up, the chains falling from his wrists. He didn't walk toward me. He slid. "You shouldn't have come here, Ethan." The lights flickered violently and I saw flashes of movement on the walls, distorted faces, lidless eyes, mouths open in silent screams. They used me. And now, they're going to use you too. He was right in front of me now. His face was pale, his eyes endless black holes. "It's too late to escape," he whispered. The ground beneath me gave way, and I fell. I fell into a dark tunnel, the air rushing past my ears as the man's scream echoed behind me. "You're part of this now." I hit the concrete floor with a painful impact. I scrambled forward, trying to get up. I was in a narrow, dark hallway, metal doors on either side. Muffled screams came from behind them. A door next to me opened with a groaning sound. I heard footsteps. Then his voice, "It's time, Ethan." I ran. I ran down the dark hallway, the echo of my footsteps mixing with the muffled screams coming from behind the metal doors. The air was heavy, saturated with the smell of mold and something rotten. Rotting flesh, perhaps. Behind me, his footsteps were slow, methodical. The metallic sound of chains dragging across the floor reverberated off the concrete walls. "You can't run, Ethan." The voice echoed around me, with no clear source. It sounded like it was in my head. I turned right and came across a dead end, a metal wall with no doors, no exits. My hands shook as I ran my fingers along the cold metal, searching for a way out, anything. "No!" I hit the wall hard, the sound echoing too loudly in my ears. "Let me out!" "They won't let you out," he whispered behind me. I turned, around slowly. The man in black was there, standing at the end of the hallway. His eyes were two empty sockets, a black void that seemed to suck the light around him. His face was distorted, as if it were just a mask of human skin stretched over something wrong. "What are you?" My voice came out weak, shaky. He tilted, his head to the side. "I'm the result of what happens when they go too far, when the experiments get out of control." He took a step forward. "Do you know what they're hiding here, Ethan? They're not aliens, they're human, or at least they were." I backed away until my back touched the cold wall. My heart felt like it was going to beat out of my chest. They created me, they changed me, and now they need you to continue their work. What do you want? From me?" He smiled. "I want what they want." He reached out and I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I looked down and saw thin, dark tentacles crawling up my legs. I screamed and tried to pull away, but the tentacles tightened, climbing. Up my knees, my waist, my arms. "It's too late, Ethan." His face began to change. The human features disappeared, giving way to something monstrous. His skin began to tear away, revealing twisted muscles and bones that didn't look human. His mouth opened at an impossible angle, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long. "They want you, Ethan, because you're special." I'm not special," I managed to say as the tentacles tightened around my neck. He laughed, a low, distorted laugh that echoed through the hallway. "Don't you understand? You survived because they chose you. You're next." The lights began to flicker. I heard the sound of metal doors opening behind me. Voices, screams of pain, of agony. I looked up and saw shadows emerging from the doors. Writhing figures, bodies that moved in unnatural ways, faceless, eyeless. They began to approach me, long arms reaching out toward me. I struggled, pulling at the tentacles that held me, but it was no use. "It's time for you to join them," he whispered. Suddenly, an alarm sounded. "Emergency! Unstable experiment! Evacuate immediately!" The figures began to scream and struggle. The man in black took a step back, his face contorted in a snarl of rage. The pressure on my limbs eased for a second. It was enough. I threw myself forward, falling to my knees, and crawled across the floor. I saw a door at the end of the hallway flashing red. I ran. Behind me, the screams grew louder. The man in black screamed in rage. "You cannot run, Ethan!" I threw myself against the door. It gave way. I fell into a control room lined with monitors. Security camera feeds showed dark hallways, figures moving in the shadows. One of the screens showed the man in black, or what was left of him, standing in the hallway, his eyes glowing. Another monitor showed something that made my heart stop. My face, an image of me sleeping on a gurney, with wires connected to my head. Subject 10, experiment in progress. The door behind me began to shake. I pressed random buttons on the control panel, trying to shut everything down. A female voice came from the speakers. "Self-destruct in 60 seconds. The door burst open. The man in black stepped into the room, his body contorting in eerie ways. He was losing his human form. You cannot escape. I saw a red button on the control panel. Self-destruction. I didn't think. I pressed the button. The entire facility began to shake. Lights flashed frantically. The man in black screamed, tentacles reaching out toward me. I ran to the exit. Behind me, the hallway began to crumble. I heard his distorted scream get lost in the sound of metal breaking. I ran until I found a staircase. I climbed the steps without stopping until I reached a metal door. I pushed it open hard, and suddenly I was outside. The sky was clear, the sun rising over the horizon. I lay down on the sand, breathing hard, my heart still pounding. Behind me, the facility imploded, sinking into the desert. I lay there for a while, unable to process what had just happened. Finally, I stood up and started walking back to the road. My phone vibrated, a text from an unknown number. "This was just the beginning, Ethan. See you soon." I deleted the message, put the phone in my pocket and kept walking. I knew this wasn't over yet. Did MK Ultra ever end? The truth about mind control. If I disappear after telling you this, you'll know why. I don't know where to begin, because everything I'm about to tell you sounds like something out of a nightmare, but I swear it's real. And if I don't tell you now, I may never get another chance. They already know I found out. I know this because, well, it's already happening. It all started with that message. It appeared on my phone at 3:33 in the morning. No number, no sender, just one sentence. "Do you know what they did to you?" I almost deleted it without thinking. But then a second message arrived, this time with a video attached. It was dark and shaky, as if someone was holding the phone with shaking hands. The image showed a room lit by a single cold ceiling light. In the center, a man sat on a metal chair, his arms tied to the sides and a black hood over his head. He was breathing fast, desperately. Then someone took off the hood. His face was pale, covered in sweat, but what really scared me was the blank look in his eyes. He seemed to be in a trance, and then he began to speak in a monotone, emotionless voice. "I did what they told me. I had no choice." He raised his head, looked directly at the camera, and said something that made me freeze inside. "You have no choice either." The video and cut out, and shortly after, a new message appeared. Coordinates 37.2431 again, 115.7930 W. Do you want answers? Come alone. I recognized those coordinates. They were in the middle of the Nevada desert, near Area 51. My head was spinning. I knew this couldn't be a coincidence. I'd always been interested in conspiracy theories, alien, abduction, MK Ultra. But this was different. It was too real. And the worst part, I couldn't ignore it. Something inside me, a dark curiosity or maybe an instinct, was driving me there. So the next day, I rented a car, threw some clothes in my backpack, and started driving toward the desert. As I drove down the endless straight road, the car radio started to fail. A strange hissing sound filled the speakers, followed by a distorted voice whispering, "Are you ready for the truth?" I turned the radio off, but the hissing sound continued. That's when I saw the first signs warning of military property, security cameras hidden in light poles, and a growing sense that I was being watched. When I reached the point indicated by the coordinates, all that was there was a barbed wire fence and a metal gate. No guards, no movement, just the silence of the desert. I hesitated for a second, and then the door opened by itself with a metallic sound. I guess that was when I should have turned around. But I went inside, because I needed to know. And now, I would give anything to be able to forget what I found inside. The door closed behind me with a sharp click. I could hear nothing but the strong wind whipping against the wire fence and the sound of my own rapid, nervous breathing. Something was wrong. The air felt thicker, and a feeling of oppression washed over me. as if I were being swallowed by something I couldn't see, but that was all around me, watching me. I took a few steps forward, my mind trying to process what was happening. The field in front of me looked ordinary, but a strange sense of déjà vu invaded me, as if I had been there before. Not physically, but somewhere in my mind. I tried to push the thought away, but it stayed there, lingering. I kept walking, feeling the dry ground shift beneath my feet. The sun was starting to set, turning the sky a burnt orange, and soon darkness would take over. I didn't know why, but I was certain that I needed to get to the center of that facility. Something was calling me there, but I soon realized that I wasn't alone. I heard a noise in the distance, something like soft but quick footsteps. At first I thought it was just the wind. However, the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step I took. Anxiety tightened my chest. I turned sharply, but I saw nothing, just the emptiness of the desert, not a soul in sight. Still, I could feel that something was there. I didn't know what was going on, but I was beginning to realize that there was something more to this place, something that wasn't normal. Finally, I reached a small concrete building with rusty metal doors. I tried to pull them open, but they were locked. However, a light flickered on the top of the door, and the sound of a security mechanism being deactivated echoed through the area. With a click, the doors opened by themselves. I hesitantly entered, feeling a growing sense of unease. The interior was darker than I had imagined. It looked like an abandoned laboratory. The walls were covered in tangled wires, and the furniture was broken, covered in thick layers of dust. At the end of the hallway, I saw a single red light blinking. The air was heavy, and the smell of something chemical hung in the air. I wanted to leave. I wanted to get back in the car and escape this damned place, but I was already there, and curiosity held me back, holding me back. I walked towards the red light, more like an instinct than a conscious choice. As I approached the room, I heard whispers, muffled but clear voices coming from inside. I stopped, my heart beating wildly. The voices were calling to me, as if they knew I was there. One of them stood out. It was a familiar voice, hoarse and tired. "You're closer than you think." I shuddered just remembering it. It was the same voice from the video, the voice of the man who seemed to be in a trance. I swallowed hard and kept walking. The door to the room opened of its own accord, revealing a metal table in the center, wires connected to ancient monitors, all of which were flashing in some kind of strange code. In the corner of the room, a large, complex machine sat. It hummed, softly and steadily. But what really stopped me in my tracks were the walls. On each of them was a glass screen, and within each screen, frozen images. They were pictures of people, all with blank, disoriented expressions, as if they were under some kind of control. But the most disturbing? In each of the pictures, the name Alan was written in the bottom right corner. And that hit me like a punch in the gut. I knew I was here for a reason. They were waiting for me. A knock on the door made me jump back. I turned quickly, my body freezing, as I saw a shadow move in the doorway of the room. A hooded figure stood there, staring at me. "You shouldn't be here." I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't respond. The voice echoed through the room, but there was no one there, only the shadow. I knew I had to get out, but when I took a step back, the door slammed shut, locking me inside. I was trapped, not knowing what was happening or how to get out. But then, the light on the wall began to flicker, and on the screens, something began to change. The images on the walls began to move, and they all began to look at me. And then the machine hummed, and a new message appeared on the screen. "You're next." The feeling of being watched grew exponentially. There was no longer any doubt in my mind. I was trapped. But the worst thing was the feeling that something was happening to me, something beyond the simple physical imprisonment. It was as if the room itself was closing in on me, as if reality was beginning to crumble. That machine, which until then had been just a silent, indifferent monster, now seemed to have a life of its own. It emitted a sound that was getting louder and louder, a humming that seemed to be becoming a kind of mantra. The images on the screens on the walls, those pictures of people, were now distorting, becoming ghostly figures. I could barely breathe, but the images, they pulled me closer as if something was forcing me to look, and then I saw it. On one of the screens, a picture of a woman who seemed to be in a trance, and once again the name Alan was written there, but this woman's face was mine. I felt dizzy. The vision before me began to blur with reality, and I began to lose track of where the image ended and the world around me began. I was being pulled toward the screens, as if my reflection in them was calling me. Trying to pull away, I stumbled, fell to the floor, and for a moment everything went silent. The door to the room suddenly opened. I turned quickly, but I was alone. The cold night air invaded the room, and for a second I felt disoriented. But the silence was broken by a voice, a familiar voice. Not the same one from the video, but another, softer, calmer. It came from inside my head. "You're starting to understand now, aren't you? I didn't know what to think. My body was shaking and I was paralyzed with fear, but something inside me seemed to be urging me to continue, as if the place itself was, forcing me to discover the truth, whatever it was. My eyes were fixed on the screen that showed my face, but it wasn't just a reflection. It was as if it were watching me from within, as if there was something more. And then something happened. One of the screens flickered, and I saw a hooded figure again, this time more clearly. His face was covered, but I knew it was the man who had spoken to me before, the man whose name I had never learned. He appeared, not on the screen, but in reality, standing in the doorway, staring at me. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said in a voice that seemed to echo from a depth I couldn't fathom. My mind exploded. I tried to take a step back, but the machine made a high-pitched sound, as if it were activating something, and the lights began to flicker. I was surrounded by screens, all showing the same face, mine. But now it looked blank, lifeless. "Why are you showing me this?" I screamed, trying to control the panic that was taking over me. The man approached, his steps slow and meticulously, calculated. "Because you need to remember," he said, almost with an eerie calm. Suddenly the room went cold. The hum of the machine intensified, and I felt a pressure in my head, as if something was invading my thoughts. I could no longer distinguish anyone else's thoughts from my own. It was as if my mind was being invaded by voices that were not my own. "They should never have let you know." The voice continued, now louder, clearer. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run away, but my legs felt heavy. It was as if the room was imprisoning me. Suddenly, the images on the screens began to change. They were no longer photos. They were videos of the people who were there, all under total control. Their eyes were empty, as if they were no longer there. They were puppets, controlled by something or someone that could not be seen. What I saw in each face was an emptiness, an absence of soul. I looked at the man, who was now very close. His eyes were fixed on mine. I could no longer move. He whispered something, but the phrase made no sense. Something about a new project, about wiping the mind, about the last phase. Before I could ask what he meant, the screens began to flicker, and the lights flickered again, and in an instant, everything went black. And I was alone, but at the same time, I knew I wasn't alone. I woke up to the sound of an alarm, that annoying buzzing that seemed to come from all sides, as if the room was trying to make me understand that there was no escape. My hands were tied, but not physically. It was as if my body was a puppet, and I could no longer control it. Panic took over me, but there was something else, a feeling of déjà vu, as if all of this had happened before. I was living on repeat, in a kind of mental loop that I couldn't understand. I looked around, but the place seemed different. The room I was in was no longer the one I had seen before. The walls were covered in metal material, and the screens, which had once been filled with disturbing images, were now blank, lifeless. The silence was deafening until the door to the room suddenly opened and the hooded figure appeared again. I already knew who he was, but that didn't make me feel any less terrified. He didn't say a word as he walked in, just stared at me as if he was studying me. He was no longer a stranger to me. I knew he was part of something bigger, something that had been hidden for years. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally, his voice cold. "But you were chosen, just like the others." "Chosen?" I whispered, still not understanding. "Chosen for what?" He approached me slowly, as if his words were poison, and I was slowly dying. "You were chosen to be part of something bigger. The program never ended. MK Ultra wasn't just about mind control, Emily. It was about power. And now you're at the center of it." His words echoed in my mind, reverberating like a weight, and I tried to absorb what he was saying, but I couldn't fully understand. All I knew was that I was no longer in control of my own life. My mind was being manipulated, just like those people on the screens. And I didn't know where this would go. He then raised a hand, and somehow the screens lit up again, showing more distorted images. People all with the same blank eyes, the same expressionless faces. But this time, one image stood out. It was my own image, my own face, but it was different. I was in a lab with wires connected to my brain, as if my own mind were an experiment. "This is who you really are, Emily. You were never just a normal person. They built you, manipulated you. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but I was paralyzed, as if my own emotions were being controlled. The sight of my own image made me dizzy, and everything around me began to blur. I didn't know if I was dreaming or if I was fully awake, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I wasn't alone anymore. The man's voice pulled me back to reality, or what I believed to be reality. "You don't understand yet, but you will soon. You were always part of the project. There is no escape now." And in that moment, a wave of panic washed over me. I was lost, without direction, but the worst was yet to come. I realized something, a truth that hit me like a punch in the gut. You know me," I said, my voice breaking. You were one of my test subjects." The man didn't smile, but his eyes shone in a way that made me feel like I was being swallowed. He simply nodded, as if he had just handed me a death sentence, and then the lights flashed again, faster, until everything went dark. I woke up in a different place. This time there were no cameras, no flashing screens. Everything was quiet. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, as if the air was thick with something invisible. I still couldn't process everything that had happened. What had he told me? "You've always been part of the project." How was that possible? How could I be part of something so monstrous and not know it? And more importantly, how could I escape? The man, or whatever he was no longer there. I was alone, or at least I thought I was, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. The walls around me were concrete, with no windows, no visible doors. It was as if I had been placed in a cell. Not a physical cell, but a mental cell. I tried to get up, but something was holding me back. It was as if my body had been paralyzed, not physically, but by an invisible force. I knew my brain was being manipulated, but I didn't know how far it would go. I tried to remember what had happened, but the memories were fading, as if they were being erased from my mind, one by one. Then something strange happened. A cold feeling spread through the room, like a breeze, but there was no wind. The lights suddenly came on and the man reappeared. He stood there in the corner of the room, just watching. There were no more words, just the weight of his gaze. "You're starting to understand, aren't you?" he said, his voice sounding like an order, not a question. I wanted to scream, to rebel, but something inside me told me it wouldn't matter. He knew what I was thinking. He knew everything. You've always been controlled, Emily, but now you'll understand what that means. He raised his hand, and the room began to shift. The walls stretched, distorting reality around me. Everything seemed to start moving, twisting. I saw flashes of things, people, places, faces I didn't recognize, but that seemed familiar. They were all there, watching me. I knew them, but I didn't know from where. Each flash felt more real, closer. "You're not alone," he continued, his voice softer now, as if he were explaining something to a child. "They did this to all of us. They controlled our minds, made us pawns in a game that not even you can understand." I tried to fight the feeling that I was losing my sanity. I could no longer tell what was real and what was manipulation. The images were so intense now, so vivid, that I no longer knew who to trust. My own mind was being used against me. "Don't think you're alone," he said, almost complacently. "Everyone around you, everything you know, is being controlled. You just didn't know it." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my mouth felt paralyzed. Fear was suffocating me, and all I could do was watch as my life, and the lives of everyone around me, was shaped by unseen hands. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker again, and the sense of disorientation grew. The room distorted even more, and I saw something that shouldn't have been there. The man, or whatever he was, disappeared, but before he vanished completely, he left one last message. "You cannot escape what is already inside you." The words echoed in my mind. I no longer knew what was real. I didn't know if my own memory was a lie, or if everything I was seeing was just their creation, a simulation designed to destroy me. And then everything went black. When the lights came back on, I was alone, back in my apartment. But something was different. I knew I would never be the same again. Whatever had happened to me, it wasn't just a nightmare. It was real, and it was still watching me, waiting for a moment when I would be another piece of their puzzle. I didn't know who to trust anymore. I didn't know who I was anymore. But what I did know was that nothing would ever be the same again. Their control, MK Ultra, was alive. And I was one of their test subjects, but I wouldn't be the last. What they don't tell you about the moon. I never imagined my life would change like this. In 1976, I was part of something the government should never have allowed. Apollo 20. A mission that shouldn't have even happened, but for some reason was deemed indispensable. Today, more than 4 decades later, I can no longer live with the weight of that truth. Why, after so many missions to the moon, did we just stop? Why did we never go back? I knew the moon was more than just a piece of rock in the sky, but what we really found there is something the government would rather keep secret. And now, for the first time, I'm going to reveal it. I'm a former NASA scientist, and despite everything that's been done to erase our mission from history, I can no longer remain silent. What the Apollo 20 astronauts discovered wasn't aliens, or at least not in the way you imagine. They weren't creatures from another planet. What we found was much older and much more terrifying. If you're listening to this now, it's because you need to know what really happened and why, after all, the moon is no longer a target for future missions, because what was discovered up there is not something we can simply ignore. I don't know what's more terrifying, what we found or what they did afterwards to make sure no one else knew about it. Let me start at the beginning. The mission the government would rather forget. I knew this mission was special, but nothing prepared me for what we saw. When we were called to Apollo 20, no one really knew what to expect. The project had already been shrouded in secrecy, which filled all of us scientists involved with a mixture of excitement and fear. After all, going to the moon was nothing new. We had done it 6 times already, but something had been unsettling to us from the start. The night the rocket launched, there was a strange feeling in the air, something that had never happened on previous missions. It wasn't like any other NASA mission. There was a shadow over everything, something invisible that followed us. The kind of feeling you get when you know you're about to discover something so big that it could change everything. I didn't know exactly what to expect, but my instincts told me it would be more than just a simple scientific exploration. When we landed on the moon, the scenery was as desolate as ever. But something was different. The crater where we landed felt strange, as if something had been carefully hidden there. The most disturbing thing, however, was the absolute silence, an unnatural stillness, as if the environment itself had been waiting for our arrival. The gravity of the situation seemed to weigh on each of us. The moment we stepped onto the lunar surface, I knew something was wrong. Shortly after landing, we found a structure. It wasn't a natural formation, it was a construction, but it didn't look like something made by humans. We at NASA had never expected to find any evidence of life or intelligence there. But what we found, this was something completely different. The structure was colossal, a great stone pyramid standing in the middle of the crater, with details that made no sense at all. It wasn't the work of any government or any culture we knew. There were hieroglyphics, but not the ones we studied in our Egyptology schools. They were symbols that seemed to move as we looked at them, changing as if responding to our gaze. There was something alive there, something we didn't understand, but at the same time we felt it. It was as if the pyramid was watching us, as if it knew we were coming. And the strangest thing of all, and the one that could never be explained, signs of something or someone that hadn't been left behind. As we got closer to the pyramid, we detected an entrance. The ground around it was uneven, but in perfect condition, which didn't make sense, since the moon isn't a place where things stay intact for so long. The entrance was covered in a shiny, metallic material that none of us could identify. It was as if we had discovered something that should never have been found, and it was there, at the entrance to the pyramid, that something happened. An invisible force seemed to pull us inside. We were no longer just human explorers. We were intruders, trespassing on something that wasn't meant for our eyes. Whatever was inside the pyramid wasn't just ancient, it was waiting. The mission, which at first seemed like just another page in the history of space exploration, was turning into a nightmare. The truth we were about to discover would not just be a scientific breakthrough, it would be a revelation capable of destroying everything we knew about humanity. And there, on that silent night, faced with an immense and incomprehensible mystery, we began to ask ourselves, what exactly were we sent to find? I will never forget the moment we crossed the entrance to the pyramid. The air was heavy, cold in a way that seemed not to belong on the moon, as if we were in another world. There was a kind of vibration in the air, a soft hum that made my bones shiver. The flashlight light reflected off the metal walls, but as we advanced, something strange began to happen. The walls seemed to absorb the light, creating impossibly long shadows, as if there was something moving in the depths, waiting patiently. No one said anything as we walked forward, but we could all feel it. Something was there, something that shouldn't be. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of imminent danger, as if we were about to awaken something that should never be awakened. The inner structure of the pyramid was even more surreal than the facade. The entrance took us to a vast hall, which stretched further than our senses could calculate. The space was gigantic, with pillars of metal that shone in a supernatural way, almost as if it were liquid but solid to the touch. The ground was covered in a kind of fine mist that, although cold, did not feel freezing like the lunar environment. We were hundreds of thousands of kilometers from home, but it felt like we were already inside something much bigger, something that transcended what we knew. The feeling of discomfort increased with each step. The sound of our breathing, amplified by the helmets, mixed with the persistent hum in the air. But the worst part wasn't the sounds. The worst thing was the images. I started seeing things I shouldn't see. Deep in the shadows, figures moved. Not in a human way, but as if they were flowing, changing shape like shapeless entities. Then we find a central camera. There, in the middle of it all, was a kind of altar, in the center of a large circle, surrounded by devices that none of us could identify. On top of the altar, a capsule seemed to float, fixed in the center without any visible support. Inside it, there was something, but I couldn't see what it was. The glass reflected a strange light, as if it was trying to hide what was there. I approached, the feeling of being watched growing with each step. Most bizarre of all were the writing on the walls. They were in a language that, until that moment, I thought was impossible to be human. It wasn't an alphabet, but something more primitive, more archaic and intelligent. The words did not form complete sentences, but symbols that connected to each other in ways we could not understand, as if the meaning itself was beyond our ability to interpret. He was starting to doubt the sanity of it all, but then something happened. A bright, pulsating light came out of the capsule. It didn't look natural, not like the lights humans use. She radiated an indescribable energy. We all froze. The light seemed to call us, as if it had consciousness. And, for a moment, I thought it could be intelligent, as if we were looking at something more than a simple machine. Something I thought, something I felt. Suddenly, a voice, not a physical voice, but something inside our heads. It wasn't a word, but a feeling. "You guys are here." The phrase hung in the air, passing through the headphones, invading our minds. The capsule began to slowly open. I could see then what was inside. It was a body, but not from a human being. Its limbs were elongated, thin, almost translucent, with skin that seemed not to be from Earth. The face was partially covered, but the eyes were open, fixed on me. And they knew I saw them. They knew we were there. And then, most horrible of all, a feeling of familiarity, as if I had been there before, as if this being, this thing, had a connection with me. Like I knew more about myself than I knew myself. It was a paralyzing feeling, one that made me question everything I knew about my own existence. "You shouldn't be here." The phrase echoed again in our minds, and then everything around us began to shake. The lights went out, and a deafening sound filled the room. Everything was dark, and when the lights came back on, the body was gone. Whatever it was no longer there. And we were alone again, in the dark, with something else. Something that could never be explained. And that's when I knew the mission was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. When the lights came on again, I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. The body, or whatever it was gone. The altar was empty, which was even more disturbing. Not only was the body gone, but the space around us also seemed to have changed. It was as if the structure of the pyramid, which had previously seemed solid and predictable, was now fluid, as if we were in a reality that didn't follow the rules we knew. Our senses began to emit strange signals, errors in their reading. But the strangest sensation, the one that kept us silent for the longest time, was absolute silence. There was no longer that buzz, that echo, that feeling of being watched. There was nothing, and yet everything felt heavier, more oppressive. I tried to speak, to try to give some direction to what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. Each of us seemed trapped in our own thoughts, as if what had happened there in that moment was something beyond our understanding. It wasn't something to be solved with technology or logic. It was something that challenged us at the deepest level of our perception. It was then that I heard the sound. It was soft but unmistakable. Footsteps, quick, hurried footsteps echoing through the empty chamber. It was impossible. There was no one there but us, but the sound was undeniable. I looked around trying to identify the source, but there was no one. The sound seemed to come from all directions. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered, my voice almost cracking into the void. All eyes turned to me, and I saw the same fear on the faces of my colleagues. They also listened, but before we could react, the lights started flashing again. This time, not just the lights. The ground began to vibrate, as if the pyramid was collapsing or, even worse, moving. It was at that moment that I realized we were no longer in the same place. Walls began to close in, slowly but relentlessly, as if they were compressing themselves, pressing us, trying to push us into the center of the camera. I started breathing faster, trying to stay calm, but I couldn't ignore the fact that we were being pushed by something we couldn't see. So, the capsule was back. She was floating again in the center of the chamber, but now with something else, something different. It was no longer just a capsule. It felt like a window into something that was there, beyond our reality. A faint light shone within it, but not just any light. It was as if the stars reflected there, distorted, but at the same time completely clear. I didn't know what to do. All the training, all the preparation, everything we learned about space exploration was forgotten in that instant. Nothing made sense anymore, and then that's when I saw it. A shadow, tall, long, as if a being was materializing within that light. He didn't move naturally, more like a distortion of reality itself. I knew I shouldn't look, but I couldn't look. Away. Whatever it was there, and he knew I was looking. "There is no longer any escape," the voice echoed in my mind, soft but filled with immense authority. There were no words, no sound, but I understood perfectly. I tried to move away, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. Fear took over me like a poison. Each movement seemed more difficult than the last. When I finally managed to move, I saw my colleagues around me, all equally frozen, their expressions fixed, as if they were seeing something that was holding them back. And that's when the capsule opened completely, as if it was welcoming us. Inside, something approached. I was aware that we would not come out alive. Whatever it was, it had chosen us. We knew we weren't alone there. I knew at that moment that the truth we were seeking was something no one should ever discover, something that was beyond any human imagination. I couldn't think anymore. I couldn't scream. The last thing I saw was the figure approaching me, their eyes locked on mine, and for a second I wondered if they had always been there. And then everything went dark. I woke up, but it wasn't like the last time, when the world seemed to come into focus, with everything around me slowly unraveling. No, I woke up in a completely different place. A place where there was no sound. There was no light. The air was thick, dense, as if it were being compressed. I was lying down, but I didn't know where or how. There was no one else, no sound, no sign of life, just emptiness. I tried to move, but my body was weak, as if it were in a state between sleep and death. Every muscle felt like it weighed tons, and the simple act of opening my eyes was a struggle. When I finally managed it, I realized I was in a small room, with walls that seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction. The light was dim, cold, almost ghostly. The floor was damp, and the air carried a metallic smell, as if iron had mixed with something alive. My eyes moved to a wall to my left, and there, in the center, was a small window. Through it, I saw something that made me freeze. It was the Earth. The moon was behind me, but the Earth, it was different. Not a vibrant blue sphere, but a dull, distorted thing, as if something were altering its very image. It was like a broken reflection in murky water. I didn't know what I was seeing, but I knew it wasn't what it was supposed to be. I stood up, feeling a searing pain with every movement, as if space itself were twisting around me. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt like I was no longer in control, as if something had decided for me, as if space and time had distorted, and I was just a piece in a much larger game. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry. No sound, no response. And then I heard it again, the footsteps. Those footsteps that I could never fully understand, but that now seemed closer, more familiar. They were coming towards me. There was no way to hide. There was nowhere to run. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, fear taking over me. That was when I saw him. He was there, the figure I had feared but knew I would inevitably encounter. He was standing in the doorway of the room, his eyes shining with an intensity that made the air around me pulse. He was no longer obscured by the distortion of the light. No. Now I could see everything. He was tall, an almost humanoid silhouette, but his movements were erratic, as if he were a construction made of pieces of something that shouldn't exist. I tried to scream, I tried to pull away, but my body was immobilized. Panic took over me, and whatever it was, it knew it. It came closer, the figure looming over me, its eyes piercing my soul in a way I hadn't known was possible. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice reverberating in my mind, like an endless echo. I wanted to ask him what he wanted, what was happening, but the words died before they left my mouth. Fear was consuming me from within. He was so close now that I could feel his presence on my skin, as if he were invading my very being. He bent down, placing his hand on my head. His touch wasn't warm, it wasn't cold. It was as if his presence was taking away any sense of myself, as if he was erasing my identity, my memory, my humanity. "You're not who you think you are anymore," he whispered. And in that instant, the truth of his words hit me hard. I didn't know what had happened, what this really was. But I knew that whatever it was, I would never be the same person again. Suddenly, everything faded into darkness. The sound of absolute silence returned. The weight of existence, the feeling of being trapped between two worlds, was the only thing left. I didn't know if I was still alive, if I was dreaming, or if it had all been an endless nightmare. But I did know one thing: I was no longer alone. The truth was there, waiting for me, in a place I could never understand, and now all was lost.